Hey guys, so glad you guys are joining in with us today, wherever it is that you're at. We're doing take two of kind of the message that went out Wednesday night, and we kind of fixed a couple of issues that happened during the live stream. But if you missed that, I'd really encourage you guys to check that out next Wednesday. We go live at 7:30 each Wednesday that we're not able to meet in person. And I just think it's so important for us right now to have a sense of community, even if that sense of community right now is just getting together and seeing each other comment on the videos at the same time, and just knowing that there are other people out there watching along with you at the same time. I just think that's so important for us to do. So I'd really encourage you guys to go be checking out that video. But we started kind of a new series, and so I've kind of been planning this series for a while. But then all this kind of craziness went on with the world that we're living in, and I kind of feel like I wanted to tweak it just a little bit, and I'll tell you why. So here's what we're going to do. We're starting this series called I Am. And it's going to revolve around the Gospel of John. And so the Gospel of John is this book that's been completely structured around these statements that Jesus makes that says, I am, fill in the blank. And he says it 7 different times. And so what I kind of hoped for was, and where I think this is going to really apply to us right now, is that this statement that Jesus is making in the Gospel of John is actually a continuation of statements that God had already made in the Old Testament about himself, where he revealed his name to Moses. And he says, my name is Yahweh, which in the Hebrew meant I am who I am, or just simply I am. And so we're going to unpack here in just a little bit the kind of the ramifications of what that I am statement means. What does it mean when he says I am? But before we go into that, I really want to look into the timing of God revealing his name to Moses, because I think that timing is so important. Because here's what happened in Moses' life, right? So Moses grew up in Egypt, and the Israelite people were in Egypt, and they'd gotten there by the story of Joseph. And what happened is that they're living in Egypt, and they begin to grow and grow and grow and populate. It kind of freaks Pharaoh out. He's like, why are there so many of these Hebrew people that are overpopulating? And so he kind of gives out this order where he says, I'm going to kill all the Jewish boys that are being born. And Moses is miraculously saved through that by faith of his mom. She kind of sends him down the river, and one of the princesses finds him, brings him back to Pharaoh's palace. And Moses goes from being saved to all of a sudden now he's growing up in the palace. And he grows up, right? And so he's miraculously saved by that, living in the palace. And then Moses, being a Hebrew, he kind of sees what's going on with the Hebrew people, how they're being mistreated as slaves in Egypt, and he takes matters into his own hand, and he actually murders a guy. And he murders one of the Egyptians who are abusing the Hebrew people. And Moses realizes what he'd done, and so he flees. He runs out of Egypt because he knows he's going to be in so much trouble. And he goes to the desert, and he lives in isolation. He's there for years and years and years. Isolation from all of his people, from everything that he had known, from all of the palace and luxury that he had been living in. And all the influence that he had, it's all gone now. But it's in that desert that God actually showed up to him. And I think that's so important because right now I feel like we're kind of in a desert, that we're kind of in this isolation, and we feel a little bit cut off. And it's not safe for us to be around people anymore, right? All of a sudden the government's saying, hey, you got to be within 6 feet of people, no groups more than 10. If you cough, it freaks everybody out, and events are getting canceled left and right. Schools closed. I mean, it's just crazy. And so we feel a little closed off. And what happened is in this moment where Moses had been cut off, God spoke to him. And I feel like in this moment where we might feel isolated and cut off from the rest of the world, I think God wants to speak to us. And so I think this series could be super, super, super important to us. But I want to jump back to these statements that Jesus is going to make as he kind of finishes off this I am that God had already started with Moses. And so I really wanted to go through the Gospel of John in order because that just makes sense to me. Just start from the beginning, work your way to the end. But as all of this started going down and everything started changing, I started looking at each of these statements and thinking, what is the kind of theme, what is the key thought that Jesus is trying to communicate through each of these statements? And to me, it made more sense to actually start with the very last statement, which happens towards the end of the book of John, and where Jesus says, I am the true vine. And the major theme there, really, that he's trying to communicate is this idea of connection. He's trying to understand this idea that we must be connected to the vine. And so the whole general theme of his statement and all the verses around that are this idea of being connected to the vine. I thought, well, man, when we feel those just so disconnected, man, wouldn't it be great to figure out what God has to say about connection? And so let's kind of take a look at that. Let's look at this idea of what does it mean to be connected. And so there are three typical ways that I think that we usually think about being connected. That we kind of think of the first one about being connected to resources. So we might say, well, I need this and I'm not really sure where to get it. And so we might ask a friend, well, hey, where do we get something like that? And he's like, oh, hey, I've got a guy. I know someone. I know a guy and I've got a connection. I can get you that. Right? And so because he knows this person, he has a connection to this resource. Right? Somebody that's rich and famous, we say they're very well connected. And the reason we say that, and then what we mean by that statement is that they have a lot of resources at their disposal. And so they're connected with all the resources that they have. The second way that we talk about it is a connection of knowledge. We might say that we're connected through knowledge. And so when we talk about, well, I'm really connected in a social media, what we mean by that is we really know what's going on around us. Or we can stay connected with the news, or we stay connected with updates or notifications. What we mean is we're connected to what's going on, all the information that's going on around us. And the last way that I think we think about being connected is just being connected socially, being around other people, feeling a connection between people. And so an example might be if you see a really great basketball team, for example, we might say, they're super successful. And one of the ways you might talk about them being successful is you're saying, man, they really play like a team. And what we mean by that is there's some sort of connection between them and how they play, that they're communicating in such a way that they really understand each other. They know where everybody's going to be. They know what each other is going to do. And so they play to each other's strengths, and there's this connection there, right? We say this when we're communicating with each other really well. And so when we're around our friends, we kind of feel this connection, that there's this joy that we just get to be simply around being near that person, right? Even dating, when it comes to dating, if we had a bad day, we might say, well, we just didn't really connect. Or if you date really well, you might say, we did connect. We had a great connection. Right? And so the reason I bring these up is because these are the three ways we typically think about connection. But all of these connections right now in our life are kind of severed. Right? There's this, when it comes to the resources, all of a sudden there's a strange shortage of toilet paper going on around right now. You go to the stores and suddenly things that used to be readily available are not so available anymore. And there's a resource connection that's been severed. And we look at the news around us, and there's a lot of access to news, but nobody really seems to know anything about what's going on. When is this going to end? When is this going to be over? How long is this going to take? How serious is this actually? There seems to be a lot of different opinions, and quite frankly, nobody really knows. And so our knowledge connection has really been severed. And then the last one, socially, it's pretty obvious that we're in social isolation. We're social distancing, which means that there's a separation socially that we must experience. And so all of these things around us are kind of being severed and collapsing. And so I just think, man, how important is it for us to really understand what it means to be connection? And so Jesus is going to explain that in John chapter 15 when he says, I am the true vine, and he's describing himself as being that vine. And so what Jesus does, let's just start with the verses, and we'll kind of read through them, and then we'll pick out what happened there. So let's start with the beginning of John. So in John chapter 15, verse 1, he says, I am the true grapevine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit. He prunes the branches that do bear fruit, so that they will produce even more. You have already been pruned and purified by the message I've given you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. For a branch cannot produce fruit if it is severed from the vine, and you cannot be fruitful unless you remain in me. Then he goes on and says in John chapter 15, he says, yes, I am the vine. You are the branches. Those who remain in me and I in them will produce much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Anyone who does not remain in me is thrown away like a useless branch and withers. Such branches are gathered into a pile to be burned. But if you remain in me and my words remain in you, you may ask for anything you want and it will be granted. When you produce much fruit, you are my true disciples. This brings great glory to my Father. And then he gets to the kind of what's at stake in this connection. He says, I have loved you even as my Father has loved me. Remain in my love. When you obey my commandments, you remain in my love, just as I obey my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I've told you these things so that you will be filled with my joy. Yes, your joy will overflow. And there's just kind of some key things that's at stake right here in verse 11 that I really key on, is he says you will be filled with my joy, and your joy will actually overflow. And so what he's describing with this connection here is a connection that's going to lead to abundance, right? And so he's not talking about a joy that comes from being entertained. What he's talking about is a joy that's deeper than that. Right? When it comes to a joy that's just through entertainment, I think of something like Netflix, right? So we're all stuck at home, we're watching Netflix, and I don't know if you agree with me, but right now, Netflix is kind of starting to get a little old. I'm starting to get a little bored with the shows that are on there, and I feel like, man, I've kind of watched this stuff, and I want something new, and it's just not as satisfying anymore, and it's getting a little old, and I can only watch so much Netflix. But what he's saying here is you're going to have a joy that's completely full. You're going to have a joy that overflows. It's going to be satisfying. He's describing a connection that's satisfying. And he's also describing a satisfaction that can't be severed. He says, if you remain in me, I will remain in you. It's not, I'll think about remaining in you, or I'll try to remain in you. It's, I will remain in you. That's a promise by God to remain in us. And nothing can separate us from that, right? Nothing can separate us from that. And so he's saying that one, you can have a connection that is truly deep, that is truly satisfying. And the second thing is the connection he's describing is a connection that can't be severed, right? That endures. Right, so let's look up at these. Let's see how Jesus describes having a lasting connection. We see two different things from what Jesus says. Right, so in verse 6, he says, anyone who does not remain in me is thrown away like a useless branch and withers. Such branches are gathered into a pile to be burned. And so I'm thinking about this verse, and what's he trying to communicate here? He's just saying, well, if you're connected to the vine, you thrive. If you're not connected to the vine, you wither, right? Makes sense. So if you have a branch that gets separated away from the vine, it can't survive, which means that life comes to the branch by its connection to the vine, right? This doesn't mean this isn't like necessarily a fully literal way of thinking about this. That if we don't have Jesus in our lives, that we're going to die, we're going to drop dead at any moment. Instead, it's kind of talking about something a little bit different, right? And so we think about all the way back to the original sin, back in Genesis, right? The serpent appears to Adam and Eve, and he tells Eve, he says, hey, you should eat this fruit, and she tells him, well, no, we won't, because we'll die. And he says, did he really say that you'll die? You won't die. And so she eats the fruit, and Eve doesn't just drop dead on the spot. She doesn't die. But in a sense she does, because her life radically changes, and so the quality of her life, everything that she understands, has been tainted by sin, and the quality of her life has completely been changed, right? And so to help us kind of get an example of this, kind of think about hair, right? So my wife Kayla has this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful long blonde hair, and I love this hair so much. The way she does it, and then sometimes she'll braid it, and there's different things that she does, and it's just so beautiful whenever I look at her. Right now, here's just a quick image I want to show you of what got pulled out of our bathroom drain. Right, that is Kayla's hair. This is the hair that I usually find so beautiful, but here it is, kind of revolved around this little tub shroom stopper thing that we specifically got because her hair kept clogging up the drains, and every time we dig it out, it's pretty gross, right? The gross to see this big old clump of hair. Now, what's going on there? Why is this like this, right? How did something that was so beautiful go from being so beautiful when it was on her to not being beautiful? Well, it's disconnected. It's no longer connected to her, right? And so because of this disconnection, it changed the way this hair was. It changed the quality of it. And so that's how we need to be thinking about this when it comes to life. Right, and so he mentioned earlier, when we were talking about this I am statement, that Jesus was continuing on from something that God had said before in the Old Testament about himself, when he said that I am, that's my name. And so to help us kind of understand this vine, let's kind of jump back and let's look specifically at just this phrase, I am. When God says that's his name, I am. What does he mean by that? Right? That God, he appeared to Moses in this desert, in this low spot for Moses, and he gives his command. He says, he tells him, hey, I want you to go into Egypt, and you're going to be the guy who's going to set all these Hebrew people, all these Israelite people that are in slavery, that are being treated so harshly by the Egyptian people and by Pharaoh, you're going to lead them out into freedom. You're going to be my guy. And Moses, that's a pretty big challenge. And Moses says, well, who should I say sent me? And that's when God reveals his name, and he says, I am. And so understanding what God meant by that is going to help us understand this. He says that I am, when we first look at this, what he meant to Moses is first of all, that statement, I am, means that God never changes. He says, I am, not I will be or I was, but now I am. It's just simply, I am, right? There's a resoluteness to that statement, a stability to God, that he never changes. He always is, he always am. And so there's a foundation that he can be. And so when we think about this, the vine, in the same way, that is a foundation to the branch. It has to be there. It has to be this steady, constant source that never changes, because it's what the branch has to attach itself to. Right, which means that whenever all the kind of changes in life go around, the branch has something safe and secure to hold on to, right? And so if you think about this branch, it doesn't have to worry about when the wind comes and it's going to blow the branch away, because the branch has been connected to the vine, and so the vine absorbs that wind and it protects the branch. Right. The next thing that the I am statement means is that God is a source of energy. There's an endurance in that statement, that he says, I am, and it doesn't fail, right? And there's never a moment where he's not is, right? That he's always am. And so this is true of the vine, right? That the branches need to have a source of endurance, a source of energy that can give the vines what they need to survive. And so the vine gives that to the branches. And then the last thing is that the I am means that God isn't influenced. God isn't changed by opinion, right? He's not looking for input from what other people say. He understands reality, and he acts appropriately. And so when he says I am, it's not I am who you say I am. It's just simply I am. And when Jesus describes the vine, he does this, and he says, hey, you might wither and be cut off, and he's saying, hey, anyone that's like this, that's not connected to me, is going to be like a branch that withers, and you'll be thrown away. And that sounds kind of like a threat a little bit, but Jesus isn't making a threat saying, hey, remain in me or else I'm going to kill you. He's simply stating a reality that you have to remain in me if you want to survive. And if you don't, what's going to happen is you're going to wither, and a withering branch that is of no use is going to be burned up. It's not any good to anybody. And so he's telling us a simple fact about reality, and he's telling us this unswayingness to him, that this is what it is. You need to be connected to me, because that's the only way it works. And so the truth about that is that we don't always have a firm grasp on reality, and we can't be swayed by opinions. And so we need to anchor ourselves to the I am, the true vine that doesn't change. And so as branches, we have to do that, right? The next thing that I think these verses kind of tell us is that, and it starts in verses 7 and 8. He says, but if you remain in me and my words remain in you, you may ask for anything you want and it will be granted. When you produce much fruit, you are my true disciples. This brings great glory to my Father. And so what he's describing here is he's saying that if you are connected to me, you will bear fruit, right? If you're connected to the vine, what's going to happen is that as a branch, your purpose of being connected to the vine is so that you can produce fruit. And you're going to do that. But just before this, he said that if you weren't connected to the vine, you're like a branch that withers. You don't actually produce any fruit. And so what makes this branch special is is the ability to make fruit. But the only way it can make fruit is to be connected to the vine. And so it's actually the connection to the vine that makes this branch special, right? And so we think back to this moment where God is revealing himself to Moses, and he's saying, I am. He's telling him his name. And he came to him at this huge moment in Moses' life where Moses was at his lowest spot. He was living in this desert. He'd been completely isolated from everybody else. And then all of a sudden, God dumps this huge responsibility and says, hey, you're going to be the guy that's going to go in. You're going to free all of these Hebrew people from the most powerful nation in history at that time. And you're going to free them. And that's going to be you, Moses. And Moses, like, as you could imagine, is kind of overwhelmed by this. And he comes to God and he says, well, I don't think that I'm good enough to do this. He says, I've got speech issues. I don't think that I am qualified to do this. Or I feel like I've disqualified myself from the stuff I've done in my past. And you don't want me, God. I'm not good enough to be able to do this. And he gives this whole number of excuses about why he can't do it. And what he's telling God is he's saying, I'm not good enough to do this, God. You're asking me to do something, and I'm not good enough. And then God responds with his name. He says, I am. And so as Moses says, I'm not good enough, God responds, I am. Right? And it's the same thing for the branch being connected to the vine. Right? On our own, we can't produce fruit, but when we're connected to the vine, suddenly we have the ability to do so, and it comes from the vine because we were connected to the vine, because the vine is we are, and so we can produce fruit, but it's our connection to the vine that makes us special, right? So I'm going to wrap up with this, and we're going to take a look at verse 10. In verse 10, he says, "When you obey my commandments, you remain in my love, just as I obey my Father's commandments and remain in His love." And I really want to key on this idea of remaining in Him. Remaining in the vine, because I really feel like this is where we struggle. I think we sometimes struggle to remain in the vine. When pressure and anxiety comes into our lives, we have a tendency to want to just abandon the vine. We want to leave the vine. We want to walk away from the vine. And right now, I feel like that's kind of what's going on right now is that everything around us has been severed, and we feel this pressure, and we have a tendency to want to disconnect. But just because everything around us has been severed doesn't mean that we have to be severed, right? Because we can have a connection that can't be severed, and we can have a connection that can actually satisfy. And so over the next few weeks, I don't want you guys to just be passing the time. I want you guys to be focusing on that deepest connection, right? That this is going on in our lives, and it's really difficult. And I'm not saying that it's not difficult. My heart goes out to all of the people who had these great big events planned, the students that are out there that are on whatever team that is that they're on, that have worked really hard to make it to playoffs, and all of a sudden playoffs aren't going to happen. Maybe you're in band and you worked really hard to get to a competition or to make it to state in some sort of other event, and for whatever reason it got canceled because of all this coronavirus craziness. I feel for you guys, or the seniors that may not get to have prom or graduations even in doubt. I hate that for you, and there's a very real pain that we can feel and we can empathize in this. But I think what this shows us is that everything all around us can't live up to what it promises. Everything around us is failing, and it shows us that everything around us fails. That's not something we can actually put our trust in. And so we have this opportunity with this time to let's mourn the things that are lost, but at the same time let's focus on what never will be lost, the relationship we can always have, which is our relationship with God. And let's spend some time with that. And Jesus writes and he tells us in a couple of ways that we can do this, right? In verse 7, he says, "If you remain in me, my words remain in you." He's saying, be in my word, right? We have his word. We have a wealth of knowledge and availability to be in the Bible, which is God's word to us. We need to be in that. And so he's saying that's one of our ways to do this. And he goes on and says, ask whatever you wish to be done for you. And he's talking about prayer. He says we need to be in prayer. To be connected to the vine and to remain in the vine, we have to be praying. We need to be praying. And then the last one, he says, if you keep my commands, then you'll remain in my love. And so this is kind of challenging for us to hear the word and then act on that word, to keep his commands, right? So he's telling us, here's how you can remain in me, to know what I say, to pray, to be in conversation with me, and then the last one is to do what I ask you to do, right? Those three things. He's saying will allow you to remain in me, to have this connection that will always endure, that satisfies and that can't let us down, something that we can actually put our faith in. So that's what I want to wrap up with. We're here in just a second. Here's what's going to happen. A couple of questions are going to come up on the screen for you guys to go through. So maybe you're doing this at home alone. Maybe you want to do this with a parent. Maybe you want to text a small group leader. However you guys want to do this, I would encourage you guys just to spend a little bit of time looking at these questions and thinking about these questions and kind of processing this idea of how can I improve? How can I really hold on to the vine? How can I really make that connection to the vine? And so let me just pray for you guys. Would love to have you guys tune in with us next Wednesday, and we'll be continuing this series, and we're going live. Please, again, the purpose of us going live is specifically so we can have community, so we can enjoy being around us. We want to try to maybe play some games with you guys and really get some feedback from you. So we'd love for you guys to be joining in on that. Let me pray for you guys, and then we can watch these questions. So, Lord, I thank you so much for just the way that you love us, Lord. And right now, I just ask that we see ourselves at these branches, Lord, that there's a lot of things that are going on around us that are being severed from us, Lord, in the same way that the vine is pruned. God, we kind of feel this pruning going in our lives as things are being cut away, Lord. And you tell us that you are the gardener and you prune specifically so we can bear more fruit, Lord. And I know that pruning is difficult and it hurts, Lord, and that's okay that it hurts, and we can acknowledge the fact that it hurts, Lord. But I ask that you, man, give us the strength and the wisdom to be able to see that man, you're cutting away what won't bear, Lord. And so let us focus on bearing good fruit for you, Lord. And so give us that ability, Lord. And I just we're going to call you out on this promise, Lord, for you to say that you will remain in us, Lord. Lord, don't ever leave us. Everything else breaks around us, Lord, but we know that you never will. And so we're going to put our trust in you, the true vine. And so we thank you and love you. Amen.